Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kathy Wallerstein, the Associate Director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute. Welcome to the second event in our fall conversation series, Democracy in Crisis, Democracy in Movements. Today, I have the great privilege of talking to Michael Hardt on the topic of democratic movements in times of crisis. You can watch a video of our first event in the series that took place on October 7th, Women, Voting, and US Empire, on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website. And you can also sign up for our event next week, the third event in the series, with Wendy Brown and James Vernon. And that one is titled Democracy in Crisis, ? And you can sign up for that on our website as well. And please note that that one starts at 5:10. Today starts a bit earlier so that people who want to can watch the debate. So without further ado, let me introduce Michael. Michael Hardt teaches political theory in the literature program at Duke University. His writings explore new forms of domination in the contemporary world, as well as the social movements and other forces of liberation that resist them. In the Empire trilogy, Empire in 2000, Multitude from 2004, and Commonwealth 2009, he and Antonio Negri investigate the political, legal, economic, and social aspects of globalization. They also study the political and economic alternatives that could lead to a more democratic world. Their most recent book, Assembly from 2017, addresses the power of contemporary social movements and the major challenges facing them. Michael is editor of the South Atlantic Quarterly, and with Sandro Mitzadra, he hosts the Social Movements Lab at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke. Great to have you here, Michael. Great to see you again.
Yeah, thank you for arranging it.
Of course. So we're going to speak, well, mostly Michael's going to speak, but we're going to converse for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions, which you can pose in the Q&A. So let me get our questions up. Okay. So for the first question, I'm just going to dive right in, and this is a bit of a big question, but Michael, what does democracy mean to you? And why do you argue that it's a term worth salvaging? What is the demand for democracy when you hear this is what democracy looks like in a protest? And what does it mean to demand democracy at a global level? Does the concept translate once we move beyond the nation state, or is it time for a different term? And feel free to tackle that in any order you want, and I'll chime in if you've forgotten part of it.
And thanks, that's great. I mean, I do see the work of a certain kind of political theory, or I mean, the kind of thing that Tony and I do in these books. I think a lot of the work we do is to struggle over our political vocabulary. In some ways, the primary concepts in our political vocabulary all seem corrupt. I mean, not just democracy, but equality, freedom, any number of other concepts. They seem almost unusable. And there are a lot of people on the left who do feel that democracy, you know, like you're sort of suggesting in that question, is unsalvageable. You know, democracy has come to mean, at best, regular elections and separation of powers and something like that. And yet, I mean, this is what I guess is the kind of decision that Tony and I make, which is that there is a legacy of struggles for liberation for which democracy is the key term, and freedom and equality too. But anyway, democracy, and you know, for us, and so it seems to me a concept worth struggling over. You know, people always get annoyed when you invent new concepts, and you know, and rightly so. So there's one, the annoyance of the inventing new concepts, but there's also, like I said, the way you lose contact with a certain legacy that I feel part of. And maybe just leave it at that. So when I hear it in movements, you know, I would say I would want to divide that into two questions. Like you're saying, when we hear this is what democracy looks like, this what should we, how do we understand that, or even what does it mean to me? I mean, I would say there are really two sides. There's one way of approaching it with two sides. One side, which is the internal one, which is thinking about the demands for democracy within movements, which in the US, I see this as primarily a legacy of feminist movements of the 70s and 80s. The demand that everyone speak, the demand that no one represents the movement without the structure of the movement itself. I mean, the whole questions about horizontality or so-called leaderlessness, in fact, the kinds of thinking that Tony and I try to capture with the notion of multitude, questions about internal multiplicity, these are all fitting with a demand for democracy within the movements, which I think is really strong and really important. But let me leave that one, or we could come back to that one, because I think more germane to what you're getting at is the maybe external one, demand for democracy. What, for me, most present is still the various movements of 2011, Egypt and Tunisia, especially Spain, 15M movement, so-called indignados, partly because in all of these movements, democracy was thematized, as a central demand. And even in Spain, the slogan, which at first sounded naive, but became more significant to me, which is, democracia real ya, like real democracy now. Like that what we have is obviously an inadequate notion of democracy. What we need to do is reinvent democracy or create a real democracy, according to them. And so I think even when it's not explicitly articulated like that, like it was in Spain in 2011, I think that the demands of the contemporary movements in general, I mean, of course one can't speak uniformly, but in general, over the last decades, have been aimed at democracy and a demand for a democratization of society. Like, for instance, think of just the last 6 months of Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd rebellion, whatever we're going to call it, which doesn't, at least in my experience, hasn't been using the term democracy as the primary demand. But their primary demands and slogans, it seems to me, are implicitly that. Like, for instance, the demand to defund the police. The demand to defund the police, to me, is not, it's about democratizing and making part of the community, really, a large part of the tasks that the police have previously been given. It's a great pedagogical slogan, or demand too, a great pedagogical demand, because it forces everyone to think, and me too, of what is the appropriate, what's the appropriate person to arrive when X happens? Like when you're clearing a homeless camp, when someone's mentally ill on the street, when there's a domestic violence couple, like who should come there? And I think that the kinds of solutions that are included within this notion of defund the police. Yeah, of course I should, like make another parentheses. Defund the police is meaning a lot of different things in different parts of the US. But I would say all of them are implicitly about a form and a process of democratization. And that seems, so I'm just putting that in line with, maybe even my point is simply that even when not said explicitly, I think that democracy has been central to the demands of the social movements of the, at least the most inspiring ones. No, I can't say it that way. Most of this book, I don't know what to say about which ones, but it seems to me a part of it. Let me try another slogan, just because it occurs to me as that it's not the same thing. It's not exactly democratization, but it's a kind of analysis. It's the intent. It's part of the intelligence, it seems to me, of these Black Lives Matter in this current cycle. And it's really, this slogan, I think it's really about a structural analysis, which does go along with the claims for democracy. I'm thinking of what the slogan at many of the demonstrations in the last 6 months, which is all cops are bastards. So at first this feels like infantile name calling, all cops are bastards. So instead of saying, whatever, there's a couple racist cops and there's just a few bad apples. No, all cops are bastards. But I think if you think about it a little bit more, it's really about, and I think this is consistent with a lot of the intelligence of this current, last 6 months. It's really that you can't think at the level of the individual subject. You have to think structurally. Like, so when you say all cops are bastards, it's not each and every cop, if you consider each one individually, is actually a bastard. No, it's that the structure in which they reside is is racist, really. I mean, that would be the way the claim goes. So I guess I think that these two do go together. Like the demand for a structural analysis and the demand for democracy within the movements. Yeah, I went sort of far on one side of that. What I didn't treat yet, we could either come back later now, is if democracy meant something within a local and a national scale, what could it possibly mean at the global level?
Yeah, no, that's okay. We can get back to that. That's interesting what you said about the all cops are bastards, almost that's has a theoretical underpinning to it. And it's not just a, kind of reactive, juvenile slogan, which I never thought it was, but I hadn't quite put it in that, in that light. And that makes a lot of sense. It's very useful. I kind of have a part two to this question, which was already had many parts. But I think it kind of, can be folded into what you were just saying, which is, can you talk a little bit about how social movements themselves, both the protests and the movements, might translate into new social and political structures? And I know that's a huge question, and you don't have to answer it in a huge way. You can just give a couple of examples, but I want to break that down into two parts, both protest and movements, because they're not necessarily the same thing. For instance, Judith Butler has written about protest in Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly as a platform for the, these are my words, but a platform for the practice of empowered subjectivity. And she writes that one can think of them as provisional versions of popular sovereignty. And then you and Tony, and certainly other people as well, have written about the ways in which movements are able to manifest a collectivity that is, non-hierarchical, that's feminist and egalitarian and respectful and so on, as in fact, not just a movement, but building blocks for a world beyond the present one. Anarchists might call that building the new in the shell of the old. There's sort of, different words you can put to that. But I guess it would be great if you could just talk a little bit about forms of democracy, within movements and as the kind of, as a sort of practice for, and even blueprint for larger social structures that, we would hope to build.
Yeah, okay, no, I think you're right, it's a lot. So let me try I have two different ways of coming in. One, and the first is about, the forms of enacting democratic or different new social relations, within the demonstrations themselves. I think one has to always recognize their, I was going to say limitations, but also their failures. That I was thinking in particular, there was a lot, or continues to be a lot, in writing and thinking about the encampments of Occupy, 2011 and the subsequent years, in their both the ways in which, both in terms of gender and race, they failed. And specifically race. I mean, that's sort of the, all kinds of incidents one gets, and in fact, Oakland is the one example, counter example almost of this in the country. But what I would say really is that one thing one notes with the movements, and this is certainly true about the Black Lives Matter demonstrations I've been to in the last months, is the desire for this kind of multiple struggle, that is at once anti-capitalist, feminist, anti-racist. I mean that each of the demonstrations I've been in the last few months is always, trans lives matter too. In addition to Black lives, it's hard to use the term intersectionality because it's become to mean so many things. But still, in my way of thinking about it, it's that there's a intersectional desire or desire for coalition. You could put it that way. As long as you think intersectionality is a kind of insubordination project, it's their desire for that. And so the fact of failing might be a kind of, it's through the internal critiques one sees it. Yeah, see there, that's what I go. Like it's not so much, that the movements are criticized from the outside, is that they're criticized for the inside, for not being successfully feminist, not being successfully anti-racist, so anyway, I trace that desire as a fundamentally democratic desire, maybe to come back to that thing. And so even when I started down that road because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, okay, like if you're looking at the movements or encampments or any number of things as a kind of like in miniature of what the future world should be, you're always going to be disappointed. Like that's it. I think instead, what seems more relevant is the kind of process and, like I was saying, desire and the fact of always being unfulfilled. Anyway, that was just one caveat, which is that not to look at the movements as an already realized utopia in miniature, but rather as a project that's always unsatisfied. But anyway, I wanted to say one other thing though, which is maybe more important, which is that, I'm all, what you were pointing towards, I guess, towards what Tony and I were saying, and Judith Butler, very rightly saying too, is pointing towards the importance of prefiguration. The fact that the movements can prefigure a better world, and that the internal organization is one way, and the transformation of our ways of living, etc. But it seems important to me to say that prefiguration is also not enough. Like that's not. The passage from the small to society as a whole. There are all kinds of let's say limitations to it, even though I think it's super important. So here's what Tony and I said at one point, so let me try it and see if it still makes sense to me, but we wrote it at one point, which was that when we look through, it seems to us that there are three alternatives, each one of which is flawed, unsuccessful, and only a kind of combination of the three could be a way forward. So the first is this notion of prefiguration that we've been talking about. The second, which we call antagonistic reformism, by which we mean a kind of entry into and reform process within the current system, however it is. I mean, something like defund the police, I consider that an antagonistic reformism, which then, of course, in each of these cities works through the city council, works in negotiation with the police force. But it's not a reformism. This is why it's an antagonistic one, because it's not a reformism that's satisfied with minimal changes that don't address the core, something like that. So anyway, and then the third one is taking power, which can take different forms and really only be appropriate in certain moments. There was a decade in many of the Latin American countries where it made sense, or at a municipal level, like in Barcelona. In any case, the three of them seem to us to have to function together. And the only reason I'm bringing those other two, which I know would require a certain amount of explanation, each one is just to say that our choices aren't only limited to prefiguration. Is to kind of give the virtuous example of what the kind of society or commune we could construct. on a miniature scale. I think that has to be, it's an important thing that has to be together with other, like a multi-pronged strategy. That sounds like I'm writing a grant or something, but I don't know. So they're different. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, it seems to me that you're saying a version of you've got to work within the system while also trying to take it down. Is that?
Yes. Right. Although I would almost consider that second one that, this antagonistic reformism is that working with the system while trying to take it down. I mean, I think there are moments when taking power is a possibility, which is not working in the system. And then the movements and their forms of prefiguration seem to me also not necessarily working within the system.
Right.
But anyway, yes, but yes to what you're saying. Yes,
right. No, but this is also always the struggle. I mean, people, right? We have immediate needs. People need to be fed. They need housing. They need medical care, and so there are kind of like immediate reasons to elect certain types of officials, to pass certain ordinances, right?
Right.
Even if it's not a structure that one thinks is ultimately at all the right one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but
but if we were limited to that, I mean, then that's what the thing of just what do we call it? The long march through the institutions. You end up getting lost in the institutions and never get out of them. That's I think that on its own is as limited as prefiguration on its own.
Yeah,
but they don't have to be. It's not an either or. That's partly what I'm.
right. No, I absolutely. I'm going to move on to another question.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Okay. In Empire, you and Tony proposed 3 axes, 3 rights, basically, that would construct an alternative to what you've termed empire. The first is the right to global citizenship. The second is the right to a social wage. And the third is the right to the control of the means of production, which is not just machines anymore. It's knowledges and forms of communication, as well as, I don't know, affect, all sorts of other things that you've written about. So I don't know if you want to talk, I don't expect you to sort of go into any kind of depth on the 3 of them, but maybe just talk a little bit about, what do those 3 look like, or how might they have changed since in the 20 years, basically, since you first wrote about them?
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about that. I mean, first the whatever the anecdotal, biographical is. I remember we were ending this long book, and when a book where you have a kind of, whatever you call it, like a revolutionary tone, or like some sort of hope of something, a reader's going to get to the end and say, well, what's your program? What are you going to do? And like, we didn't, which isn't. And so anyway, what I remember us talking about it, and we weren't being at all original with these 3. It was rather these were 3 things that we thought were perfectly reasonable and beneficial. Like, if you want to do something, here's something to do. And in retrospect, 20 years later, they do look pretty good. Well, I don't know, pretty good. So things that at the time I think were considered completely impossible and kind of like a illusory dream, now don't. Well, okay, so the first one, essentially it's a no borders argument. And granted, it's still quite a minor argument, but much more considerations about the impossibility of the kind of border fortress regimes we have in North America and Europe. Anyway, second one, basic income, which like I say, 20 years ago, it seemed like a ridiculous thing for people to say. Now basic income has a great deal of purchase Yeah, in a variety of places. The third is hard, of course, reappropriation of the means of production, which, as you say, in an era in which knowledge um, and the affects or any number of things in addition to machines or digital machines and algorithms. Although there too, like there's some interesting experiments. I shouldn't go down this road. I was thinking about these Deliveroo drivers in Belgium who went on strike, and their demand was to control the algorithm. Like that seems to me, that's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. Control the algorithm, if that were possible for Amazon drivers. But I guess what I should say about all that, though, is fits in with the kind of reforms that I was talking about earlier. I mean, these aren't really in themselves revolutionary propositions. These are sensible reforms. Yeah, I've over the years had a lot of people criticize me for saying good things about basic income when they said, but that's not revolutionary. Of course it's not revolutionary, but it could still, like you're saying, it could be extraordinarily beneficial for people in the meantime. Like reforms are important. I've no problem. So these things aren't meant to be sufficient. They're meant to be something that one could do now. Yeah, I guess, I mean, maybe I should say this another way that maybe is the more generalized thing about it, which is, I was going to say that if anyone, wants to be whatever for a certain kind of revolutionary theorizing, that sounds a little pretentious. Maybe it's just any political thinking. It seems to me it always has to go on at least two temporalities, like the recognition of the continued focus on on what we want, about ultimate goals and all the things that are necessary to get there, and in all its radicality, doesn't need to contradict. In fact, it shouldn't contradict things that in the immediate have to be done to actually help people that, and so I don't, okay, here's the third way of saying it, then I'll stop with this just because I feel like I'm piling on too many explanations of the same thing. This is a more theoretical stepping back. There are moments in history, I think, when that division between reform and revolution have been super important and require lines of battle. Now is not one of those times. I think that there isn't, and there shouldn't be, a contradiction between thinking progressive reforms and a goal of a more thoroughgoing transformation. So I'm perfectly happy with that kind of those completely insufficient, but nonetheless, I think beneficial, pragmatic goals. I would write them differently now, like I would pose it in a different way, but still, it's aren't you? It's a little bit like. I've almost never done this, but you discover a paper you wrote in like 8th grade, and you're like, hey, you're like scared to read it, and then you read it and says, well, that's not so bad. So anyway, I feel a little bit like that when you bring up these three things. I think that's not so bad. That's like, I'm surprised. I was a little scared of it, but it seems okay.
And I might loop back to this later because I mean the fact that the right to a social wage, for instance, is no longer such a radical. I mean, like you said, it was never a radical concept. I mean, that's just like incredibly the most basic, reasonable, right? But the fact that it's even on the table, right, or that universal health care is on the table, I mean, is of course the result of social movements. So I just want to say that. And but I have a question about the elections and voting at the end that maybe we can tie that into.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you about climate change. And the question really is, are there democratic mechanisms available to address something as urgent as the climate catastrophe that's unfolding at warp speed right now? Basically, we don't, I mean, the sense is that we don't have time We don't have time to build a true democracy, whether you call that socialism, whether you call that communism, whatever you call it, we don't have time to build it. And we also, working within the system doesn't do it either, because it's so incredibly insufficient and it's so incredibly corrupt, and all these things that we know. I mean, even the Paris Climate Accord, which was so, barely enough, we pulled out of. So I guess what to do about this question of the climate catastrophe, which is really what we need to call it, when we don't have time to figure out democracy.
Yeah.
Either via reform or via revolution. And I just also want to say, I don't expect you to actually have an answer.
Of course. I
mean, I needed to put it on the table for discussion.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's important. I mean, in one way, my initial way of approaching it would be, like I was saying a minute ago, about this sort of dual temporalities. Like it's clear that that capital is destructive of the climate. That an anti-capitalist movement has to be part of a way of addressing climate change, and it also seems clear to me, this is harder to argue, that ultimately mechanisms for democratic decision makings about it have to be part of it. I mean, that the fact of the way we share the planet, that we have this planet in common, that in way decisions have to be made in common about it. But both of those things, like you're saying, don't seem to provide for the urgency. I think that while maintaining our eyes on the need for such radical transformations, there has to be, and one has to be open to and pursue as strongly as possible all kinds of reforms, Green New Deal, any number of other international accords. But one thing, and I don't have better. Other people have better ideas than I do about the nature of those reforms. But the one thing that does seem to me is that's a powerful thing, is how much the movements have changed a widespread social understanding of it. Like that there's been a kind of, if not global, very widespread public pedagogy that the movements have conducted. I remember in 2009, I was at the Copenhagen Climate Summit, and there was, or rather at the movements outside of the climate summit. And it seemed at the time, it seemed at the time that it was impossible to mobilize a certain kind of public opinion. And yet, in the past years, not just the past 10 years, but the last 3 or 4, a new generation, not even in their 20s, from 15 to 25, have really transformed the way, or these sort of sea changes of global public opinion are just incredibly remarkable. What the effect will be isn't yet clear, but it happened so rapidly. That's all I'm trying to point to for it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That is, I mean, you're right. It did happen very rapidly, and my own daughter is very involved in this, so I'm very, very aware of all the, of this incredible network of youth. I mean, we all are, Greta Thunberg and so on, but there's just, yeah. I mean, I guess that in itself is very encouraging, just that things can change so quickly.
Yeah.
I mean,
and powerful even if I can't yet express what the power will result in.
Well, exactly. I mean, I'm still, terribly worried, as we all need to be. But
we should be.
I agree that that the youth are onto something, and they're on fire. Yeah. Okay, maybe we pause on that one, and maybe somebody
Mhm.
from the audience will have some enlightening thing to say about this. I did want to move on to some more questions. I had a question about models. Are there any existing models, or what existing models of social organization exist today that we can look to for inspiration? So that, to quote your words, so that the multitudes can compose their forces into effective counterpowers. And, I don't know if it's necessarily a model of a particular governing structure or of an ideology or just of a way of being. I, for one, have been very taken with the notion of buen vivir, which Evo Morales, of course, wrote into the Bolivian constitution. It's an indigenous term which denotes the fullness of life rooted in community and in harmony with other people and nature, or even the Zapatistas, another movement and model, which a lot of us have drawn inspiration from. But I guess these are kind of, how do we translate these concepts, if indeed we want to, of mutual aid and so on, again, onto a global scale. So this is, again, that question of, we kind of know how to do certain things locally, very imperfectly, as you pointed out, in our movements and so on. But how do we think globally using these concepts? And I will add, I just wanted to add this quote that I love. I think I talked to you about it, of Eduardo Galeano about utopia, which I find really useful in thinking about how we're moving forward without actually having any answers, which is really actually okay not to have any answers yet. And the quote is about utopia, and it goes, "Utopia is on the horizon. I move 2 steps closer. It moves 2 steps further away. I walk another 10 steps, and the horizon runs 10 steps further away. As much as I may walk, I'll never reach it. So what's the point of utopia? The point is just that, to keep walking." So I wanted to say, in that framework, what models maybe exist, not to provide answers, but to give us a direction to walk in.
Yeah, that's great. But it occurs to me while you're saying it that well, there's some ways in which what I'm thinking about models is at least distinct from, maybe not in tension with, the notion of struggle that I'm seeing as his, that we keep walking, that, because I'm a firm believer in that. Yeah, but let me back up to the models and then try to circle back. I do think, in the last couple decades, there have been a lot of experiments that at different levels that I've considered very useful models. Not just the Zapatistas, like you said, but with all their faults, the different so-called progressive governments in Latin America, in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela in its own way. It's all complicated. They're all quite complicated, but I think all of them were, and in fact, them together as a kind of continental experiment were quite, how should I say, they, would not serve as models in the sense that we're going to repeat, that anyone should repeat it, but rather that see them as a kind of laboratory, a terrain of experimentation, that functions for elsewhere. And there are plenty of others too. The municipal government of Barcelona seems like a great example to me, or a number of other ones like that. But what do they function? I guess I would put it this way, because you're asking, you're asking both about models, but then you're asking about how does it translate to a global scale or get beyond its locality. And my way of thinking that, or where I look towards first, is to the construction of cycles of struggle. I guess this is shifting a little bit, and I'll have to come back to those models, because the way I think of it, like 2011, for instance, that we had a series of, these various occupations and encampments. We had a series of discrete ones which had very local questions, about in Tunisia and in Egypt about a certain form of authoritarianism, in Greece something different, and in Spain coming to the US something quite different, and then we could continue on to Turkey in 2013, Brazil, etc. Each one is different, and yet they do gain a kind of translocal and tendentially global resonance when they function as a cycle. When they function as a cycle, meaning that they take from each inspiration and repertoire practices and aspirations. And we see that, it seems to me, this was something I experienced in 2011 to 2013, more or less. The connections with them, among them were quite real. So that even there was something both extremely rooted in the territory. I don't know, in Madrid, each neighborhood had different questions and about housing, about sexual violence, about etc. So super rooted in the territory, and yet at the same time able to extend. Yeah, so it wouldn't be this. Maybe I'm emphasizing so much because I don't know. There's an old imagination would say, okay, well, you need some global directorate. Somebody's gonna, I don't know, global party, some central something or other that can direct. You guys do this, and we'll do that. The old Comintern type thing, or I don't know, something like that. Whereas I think it functions completely differently. I think it functions much more rhizomatically, by by underground tunnels, and yet they are connected. And so it does have that kind of global extension. It seems to me. That's where I would go for the how does it attain or arrive at that global level.
Well, that actually kind of bleeds into my next question, which was very much about the in fact, the interconnection of all of these different movements. But I would love to ask you to also take a step back and maybe talk about the alter globalization movement or movements of the 1990s and early 2000s, in particular the World Social Forum, the various summits and so on, and how, in what ways that gave rise to all the movements that you just mentioned, the Arab Spring, the Indignados, Occupy Wall Street, and so on and so forth. Maybe also, where that is going to, what comes next, basically, from all of this. Yeah, and then I have another part of the question that I wanted to ask you about migration, but let's just let's put that aside right now.
Well, before that, part of the hard part of that is how did that moment, of the World Social Forum moment and the WTO in Seattle moment, how did that moment lead to the present movements? And let me defer that one for a second, because I think there's something else about the alter globalization movement that in retrospect, especially, I find super important, which is that it was a great theoretical project. That it was a great theoretical project because the movements themselves were trying to understand what this new global order was and where it was located and how it worked. And so, there was at the time, and rightly so, a lot of criticism of the summit hopping. Like one weekend it was, I don't know, it was WTO in Seattle, next weekend it was in Montreal, and next weekend it was in Gothenburg, whatever, and there was a kind of activist moving from one to the other. Some of them, a lot of them, of course, were from each place. But that had an incredibly important theoretical function, it seemed to me. Like they knew, if they thought that Washington, if the US was really running the world, they should have every weekend been in front of the White House. But they knew instead that there was this new centers of power that were actually emerging in a global frame. And so I would say that each summit was kind of a mode of experimentation to illuminate another node in that new web of power. So one weekend it's the WTO, and the next weekend it's the World Bank and the IMF, and then it's one it's free trade in the Americas, the next one it's the G8 meeting. And so by putting all of these together, you construct a kind of constellation of a new global power. Like it was, so the movements themselves were able to think globally. That's what, I think that's an extraordinary achievement, and something that, it had its drawbacks. Like I said, there was justified, I mean, I'm totally in agreement and was participating at the time in sort of criticism about not being firmly enough rooted in the territory, not struggling enough about direct things, so that, I don't know, I remember Students Against Sweatshops, which I thought was quite an inspiring movement at the time. But they were oriented towards whatever, the sweatshop in Indonesia and the sweatshop in Vietnam, and not about the real problems within their communities where they live. But given that, I mean, I think that's right, and there's been a kind of numerous, correctives to that. But given that, still, I think it's important to recognize that. I mean, I would say here, back up another thing. One of the things I'm a real advocate of is like recognizing the extraordinary theoretical work that's done in movements. That it's obviously not that whatever intellectuals think and activists act. That in movements themselves, there's always a very rich theoretical development that's going on. And in particular with the ultra-globalization movement, that's what I'm just, in retrospect, that when you bring it up that way, it makes me think that it's even that since then we haven't had, or at least I'm not thinking of any right now, a movement that has the same ability to achieve a theoretical development of a global power structure, which we continue to face. That's what I guess I would also say, that we're in lack of that kind of theorizing right now.
What about the 99% slogan? I mean, was that
Right.
sort of a new theoretical apparatus by movements globally?
It was, and it did serve really important purposes, both within the movements, and then also you could say that Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign wouldn't have been possible without the recognition, the widespread pedagogy about social inequality, wealth inequality, in the US that was conducted through the various occupies, or Elizabeth Warren's political career at the national stage wouldn't have, that in some ways, both within the movements and like I'm saying, in the established electoral sphere, I think that it did have important effects. The 99%, I'd have to think more about how to express what fills that out, rather than just as a simple slogan. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a great answer. All of that. We'll probably want to wrap this up within 10 minutes, and I do want to ask you about the elections, but I wonder, I don't know if there's time, I'd like to ask you, in these cycles of insurgency, you and Tony have talked about, and others as well, about migration as an insurgency. Could you just say a few words about that? About what that means?
Yeah.
Or is that too much?
Well, I mean, once one calls contemporary migration in a wide pattern a kind of insurgency, you have to recognize it's a weird term to use in some ways, because the migrants themselves, by and large, are not conscious of being engaged in a large-scale political program. They're not, and of course, there's seldom large-scale organization. The caravans are one of the most things and yet one has to recognize the ways in which migrants and their continual pressures are what is undermining the border regimes, that is transforming global space. I think that if one looks at it as an objective fact, rather than asking subjectively about the intentions of the migrants themselves, one can see that it does pose and is transforming, I think, national borders and these great border regimes. In some ways, it's a force of internationalism. I mean, that's what I've, because I'm in many ways looking for, and that's certainly one of them that seems most important to me, looking for ways, movements in the present that are the inheritors of the great forms of internationalism of the 20th century. Like where can we look in that? And it seems to me an important, essential element now. And in some ways, I realize, and maybe I'm not even expressing well enough why, that migrants they're an unusual subject to pin that on, because it's not, I don't know, the tricontinental or the various ways that in the 20th, especially in the late 20th century, internationalism had its political forms. But anyway, it's a good place to start. It's certainly not the only way to locate the forces of internationalism or the possibilities of internationalism today. But it's one that seems, really important to me.
Thank you. Let me ask you one last question, although I have many more, about the elections, which we need to talk about that. So, everybody's talking about how important it is to vote in this election. And so I want to ask you not what the risks of Trump winning entail, because I think we all know those very well, but what are the risks of Biden winning? What are the risks of Biden winning? I mean, what might seem less urgent if he wins? What sort of, I'm thinking along those lines.
Well, there are a bunch of different ways of approaching this, but from the conversation we've been having, and about the movements, one might view a choice like this as, in terms of selecting a better enemy. In some ways, I would say the great advantage that we have of Biden winning is that he's a much better enemy to have. Meaning, like, look at what kind of activism is favored by each. In some ways, and this is maybe a theme sort of that I'm realizing now as part of the conversation, I think that, or maybe this is a hope, that a Biden presidency would in some ways open a season of movements something like the 1990s. There'd be something like facing Bill Clinton. So I guess I should go, like about Trump being elected, of course, reelected, there are all kinds of nightmares. One could think in all kinds of important things happen. But from the perspective I was just saying, the kind of movements it favors really seem to me the necessary, perhaps, but also the least productive and least intelligent. The kinds of threats of various kinds of fascism or various elements of fascistic elements of white supremacists, thugs with guns in the streets. I mean, these kinds of things are necessary to oppose, but seem to me the least, even if necessary in those circumstances, with different circumstances, they're the least productive of movements. It's something like, here, let me go back, because I realize I'm not quite getting this right, or I'm not quite explaining it right. I remember feeling after 2001 and certainly by 2003, the ultra-globalization movements in their many forms were essentially closed down and transformed into anti-war movements. And it was absolutely necessary at the time, with the so-called war on terror, occupations in Afghanistan and Iraq. But all of the qualities that made the ultra-globalization so productive to me, both, like I was saying, its theoretical intelligence, but also its internal multiplicities, its It's why differences, everything got closed down into anti-war. And in some ways, struggling against Bush, I mean, against Trump, lapsus, is something like anti-war. I mean, on a domestic scale. It encourages movements that are, you know, if not militarized, at least focused on that questions of defense, you know, and force. So I guess I'm just coming back to the danger, of course, that you're pointing to, you know, the danger of a Biden presidency is if somehow, if Biden were elected, people would breathe a sigh of relief and go home and assume that he'll take care of everything. I just don't see that as a real possibility. I mean, that's what I meant, like a little bit like the late 1990s. I think it's a much more rich political context in which to struggle, and I can't see any reason why the already existing movements wouldn't, you know, continue and flourish against that government. Okay, and now I should say one other thing at a different scale. Like there, I was just talking about the view from the movements. Obviously, but now I'm talking ways that people, I'm sure many people watching much better than me about it, is I have no idea whether if Biden elected, if he'll return to those motions of opening towards the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, or if he'll be something more like he's been during the campaign, which is disavowing everything about that might be accused of being part of the left. And you know, like for instance, will he point a lot of Bernie people in the administration? Yeah, and I have no idea, and I have no idea about that. It seems to me one of the more interesting questions to go on. But the real thing I guess I'd want to say is that once he's elected, just recognizing that now we have the real chance to have productive struggles. That seems to me the, and that's what I have a certain kind of confidence will happen.
Well, that's great. I like your confidence. And I think I mostly agree. Okay, so that's a great note to end our conversation on. And we have a bunch of questions already from the audience. Okay, so the first one I'm going to ask is about sovereignty and its history. Do you still believe or argue that the erosion of sovereignty has led to the emergence of a form of global empire, or has a waning sovereignty led to an unstoppable domination of neoliberal capitalism?
Yes. Okay, so there are a bunch of different ways we tried thinking this. You know, now I'm thinking back 20 years that, or 25, Tony and I were trying to, in the late 90s. And one of the, I remember thinking at the time it was like SAT questions I had, which were like, A is to B as C is to what? And the A is to B was national capital is to the nation state, or rather the nation state is to national capital. Like the nation state's necessary to guarantee the collective interests of national capital and think its future and stuff like that. And if that can do it for national capital, if there's emerging such a thing as global capital, because no nation state can, what sovereign body or what political institution or set of institutions can guarantee the collective interests of global capital? That's what we were saying was empire. So I would say, yes, that is about an institutional structure in which neoliberalism is guaranteed and is flourished through, you know, like we had said at the time, it's not like the nation states don't matter. They are certainly part of this, especially the dominant ones. but then also there's a realm of supranational institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, etc. And then there are other non-state bodies that are part of this. So anyway, I guess I didn't see it in the question. Maybe I misunderstood the question. I don't see that as an alternative. I think that's a yes and, or both and.
Thank you. Okay. Can you tell us a bit about the Mare Jonio migrant ship?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Mare Ionio, like the Ionian Sea.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll give you the brief version. It's a project that I've been involved with since the beginning, a little over 2 years ago, but sort of external. It's an Italian project of migrant rescue, and that's the name of the ship. So we bought a ship. We bought a ship when the right-wing government in Italy was criminalizing all humanitarian activity in the Mediterranean. Not allowing like ships that are run by Doctors Without Borders, not allowing them to dock in Italy when they had picked up migrants, and in fact making monitoring and rescue impossible. So we bought a ship with the idea that an Italian activist group, that I was part of, with the idea that if an Italian ship with an Italian crew flying an Italian flag couldn't legally be denied port within Italy. So for the last 2 years, it has gone out on these 2-week missions and often monitoring, but then other times picking up migrants who were and the project, like the most visible part maybe is the part at sea, but it's also mostly in Italy, like public project, not just education, but a public expression about migration and racism, which in Italy and in Europe pretty much go hand in hand. So anyway, that's been, I think, super successful and really great project, together with a number of other ships, bigger projects too, in the Mediterranean that are part of this migrant rescue thing. Yeah, but I guess I should point out, and well, this would take longer for us to really say, it's not just a humanitarian project, it's really a political project. I mean, it's using a humanitarian emergency to initiate a political point about migration and European and Italian racism and anti-migrant structures. Okay.
Absolutely. I want to remind people to post their questions in the Q&A. Yeah, it's a great project. Joshua has a couple of questions, and I'm going to choose the shorter one. Why is the premising of E.G. Sanders' 2016 on the theoretical savoir-faire of the Occupy movement, following on the movement of the Squares and the Arab Spring, treated as a good outcome, something to be celebrated about Occupy, rather than a familiar catastrophe of empirical provenance, wherein the urgencies and indeed potentialities of social movements are absorbed, muted, and finally sniffed out by national electoral politics?
Well, I guess that's where, I mean, I recognize the, the dangers of co-optation. Maybe that's what, and I agree. I do, though, and this is what, see, I really miss being, I wish we were in the same place so we could actually have discussions. But what I was saying earlier, this sort of fits into that category for me of that reforms, and that's what, I would see that Bernie's candidacy in both of 2016 and 2020 as reformist projects, I see those as beneficial to the more radical project too. That they create a terrain of greater possibility. When it's sort of the slogan I was saying earlier was, I don't know if this is quite slogan, but but that I don't think that today's a moment to say that reform and revolution are contradictory, and that every reform blunts revolutionary possibilities. Yeah, I guess that's the way I'd say it. I mean, there's another classical way of saying it, Lenin way of saying it, that there are some reforms that open up revolutionary possibilities and some reforms that close them down. One has to be able to distinguish between the two. But I would say things like the Green New Deal, things like Bernie's candidacy and the kind of energies it's brought together. The Sunrise Movement, the different. I mean, there are all kinds of things that have been under that umbrella that have fostered and intersected under that umbrella of Bernie's movement. I guess I see them as positive. Creating more possibilities rather than blunting them. But that's yeah, I don't know. It seems like a real and important conversation to have. And if Joshua were right here, we would be able to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Big regrets that we can't be in person and having that and many conversations that would emerge organically if we were face to face. Okay, Samara Steele has a question. I would be curious to hear your views on worker co-ops and syndicalism, especially in terms of their tactical efficacy within the US right now.
I don't think I have anything. I mean, it's it seems like yeah, I think I have anything particularly interesting to say about them. I guess I want you to say more about them. See if it could work on the chat. Could you say more about what you like, what specifically you're interested in, how it fits? Because I'm not really sure where to take the suggestion. I don't know if it can work that way on our
Yeah. So Samara, that's an invitation to write in
or
the
request, yeah.
Chat, or you could do it in the Q&A, I guess. And maybe we can
Circle back. Yeah.
Yeah, circle back to it. I'm not sure if she can write in the chat, but if she can't, she can write in the Q&A. Okay, so let's see what's next. Okay, has technology and especially social media affected movements and political trajectories in ways that have surprised you as you think back to your writing empire?
Yeah. Yeah, surprised me, of course. I mean, I do remember Tony and I were in Paris when writing Empire. I remember we were really enthusiastic about a nurses' strike. This was in the early 90s, that used Minitel to organize, which for people who hadn't spent time in France and whatever in that period, it was sort of like the French version of the internet, which had this provincial local thing. And it seemed incredible to us, that they could use that as an organizing tool. And now in retrospect, it feels, the most basic of things. But the one thing I guess I would say that might lead somewhere more interesting is that it's not so much. It seems to me, or here's my perspective on it. I'm not saying that this is the truth or something, but the way I've seen it, it's not so much that the new communicative technologies, social media and various forms, it's not so much that they have transformed the movements. It seems to me that the technologies have been adopted as organizing tools that already fit the structures of the movements themselves. So the possibilities of horizontal communication that was already that was structured in various forms of social media found a home in the movements because the movements themselves were already structured that way. So it's more like, there was a moment in, around 2011 where there were a lot of newspaper reports, about how this was Facebook revolution or something like that, as if the technologies had created the form of organizing. And I think it's much more interesting to see it the other way around. Not that the organizing created Facebook or something, but that it was adopted, or Twitter was adopted, or different in the different moments of different ones were adopted because that the geometry, the organization, the movements themselves was already corresponded to, kind of matched with what the technologies were. Anyway, you asked me what most struck me about the changes, and it's really that it's the correspondence between the forms of organization, the movements, and their architecture or something like that, and that correspondence with the communicative technologies.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it seems to me that there's been like a certain co-evolving though, right, of the technologies with the movements, with this sort of, the networked movements. A certain networking that has happened only because of technology, but even though, like you said, the technology fit into existing structures. So I mean, I think it's interesting to think of them as a sort of
co-evolving creatures. Yeah.
I am being encouraged to read Joshua's first question.
Good. Thanks,
long.
Joshua, for coming.
You can even read along in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Maybe I should, because it sounds like it's something I'll have to figure out.
Yeah. Okay. So for all its virtues and provocations, my experience of political theory is for the most part as an astonishingly enduring version of the no true Scotsman fallacy, except the subject is democracy. No matter how much...
Oh, a second. Can we stop for just a second there?
Yeah.
Well, do you know what the no true Scotsman fallacy is? Because I don't.
No, I don't.
Okay. Okay, let's keep going, and then if we need it, we'll figure it out.
Okay.
Apologize. Except that. Holy smokes, guys. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Democracy. Okay. No matter how much evidence is provided by history that actually existing democracy has been, without fail, best case, a mode of reconciling humans into capitalist relations, worst case, abattoir, and regularly, both of these things.
Okay.
And no matter the absence of contra-evidence, political theory without fail manages to say, but true democracy, ... and then coughs up some etymological bullshit about the demos. It's obviously a fallacy designed to preserve a non-existent fantasy. B, why not just stop saying that? Why not just stop saying that, it being a whole lot of futile effort and even deceit, if not simple ideological closure? Why not say, yeah, we have a whole lot of evidence that it is inadequate to the categories of emancipation and joy, and let's honestly open ourselves to other conceptual horizons?
Well, I'm wondering if I'm conceiving democracy in some radically different way than you are. That's what I'm wondering. And so I don't think I need the no true Scotsman thing, even though I confess my ignorance, and I promise I'll learn what it is. No, I understand democracy in rather simple terms, that we all together can rule ourselves. That's I mean, I think conceptually, at least I find that a satisfying, even if super minimal thing. But also, there are all kinds of, it's not just that, how you put it there, it's not just that all of these are failures. I mean, the instances of democracy in, struggles in workplaces of self-management, or democracy at all kinds of levels. I don't know. It doesn't seem to me the what do you call it? The desert in its experimentations in the past. But I still see it as the political form of collective and equal decision making. I mean, that's what, but I guess I wouldn't object to having another name for it. But like I said, I mean, this is what I said at the beginning. This is the part I'm struggling with in the question is, I do feel like there is a long history of struggle for which that has been a central aspiration, and that I feel part of that, and I feel part of that legacy. So that's part of the reason it's important. It seems important to me to hold on to it. And I think it doesn't seem to me contradictory to be able to argue against, the various forms of things that pass as democracy now in journalistic prose, and a struggle for this. Oh, here's one other thing, but maybe this is where we could start, Joshua. Would the fact that that there's, I think, a movement on the ideological right in the US today against democracy, like against using that as a term, like that they argue the US should be a republic, not a democracy. Maybe that would make it, that could give me, that could give us some more purchase. Okay, you're right. No, it's not the enemy. Okay, it's Joshua was just saying, and I just read something, maybe I shouldn't be reading the chat. That if they were against, something else, does that mean we should be for it? And obviously not. But I do think it's an interesting development, that we move from the Reagan era when a completely corrupt notion of democracy seemed to be the central thing, that I think that it has fallen off on the right as a central term. But you're absolutely right. It's not the enemy of our enemy is not our friend. Yeah, I'm with you.
So it's 10 to 6, and the debate starts at 6. I don't know how many people are actually want to watch it, but I'm sure some people are going to want to. And I'm also aware that you've been talking a lot. Do you want to take one more question, or should we wrap it up? It might be a good place to wrap it up.
I'm happy to go with I mean, it's true, 10 of 6, if people want to go do something before watching the debates, maybe it is the right time.
Yeah, okay. I think it's probably the right time. It's been such a great pleasure talking with you, and I really—
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I'm glad to do this with you. That's very nice.
Hope next time it's in the same room.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So everybody, if you know of someone who wanted to be here but couldn't be, this will be up on our YouTube page, and those of us who know each other can keep talking after the fact. Okay. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye, Michael.
Bye.